بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أفضل خلق الله على سيدنا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام. ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah, we went through yesterday from this, he gave us the benefits of, the 15 benefits of taqwa. Did everybody get those? Yeah, all right. So Bismillah. Now he's going into the second section because he in the beginning, he told us there were 3 sections that he was going to look at in terms of taqwa. So he gave us the first, which is the benefits that are derived from the Quran. And the beauty of this book is he told us he is only going to give us directly from the Quran the basis of the ilm al-tasawwuf. So he says, الفصل الثاني في الباعث على التقوى وهي 10 خوف العقاب الدنيوي ورجاء الثواب الدنيوي وخوف العقاب الأخروي ورجاء الثواب الأخروي وخوف الحساب والحياء من نظر الله وهو مقام المراقبة وهو لقوله وكان الله على كل شيء رقيبا والشكر على نعمه بطاعته والعلم لقوله إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء وتعظيم جلال الله وهو مقام الهيبة أو صدق المحبة فيه لقول القائل تعصي الإله وأنت تظهر حبه هذا محال في القياس بديع لو كان حبك صادقا لأطعته إن المحب لمن يحب مطيع ولله در القائل أيضا وقائلة قد سألت عن حال عاشقها لله صفه ولا تنقص ولا تزد فقلت لو كان رهن الموت من ظمأ وقلت قف عن ورود الماء لم يرد. So the second section, he says, is on those things that engender this desire for taqwa in the hearts. So you have the ba'ith is what stimulates you to do something. It's the motivating factor in something. So these motivating factors of taqwa are 10. The first is a fear of punishment in this world, a worldly type of retribution, iqab. And human nature is that we tend to fear pain. In fact, fear of pain is probably a greater immediate concern than a desire for pleasure. So when given 2 choices and the possibility of one or the other is equal, people will choose to avoid pain and to acquire some pleasure. They did a study in the US, and it was, I think, a 30-year study. It was a very interesting study, but they did a 30-year study where they took these 5-year-old kids and they offered them a cookie. They said, you can have this cookie right now, or if you wait 10 minutes, you can have 2 cookies. And then, so the children were very different in their choices. Well, what they did is they monitored these kids over a 30-year period, and they found almost consistently the children that delayed their gratification for a greater reward were far more successful in life than the ones that wanted it immediately. It was a very interesting study. So the delay of gratification, some temporary deprivation, is very important. And the basis of a lot of what's going on in the Quran, the idea of delaying gratification. Because the people of dunya, they want كَلَّا بَلْ تُحِبُّونَ الْعَاجِلَةَ وَتَذَرُونَ الْآخِرَةَ. You know, you put off what's coming and you want this immediate pleasure. So, lust is, people fall into lust, it's an immediate pleasure, but they don't think of the repercussions. So if somebody cheats on their spouse, they don't think about all of the repercussions, the destruction of their marriage, the breakdown of trust, all these things that happen. For some short-term pleasure that in the end is meaningless and empty. There's no real spiritual or even social basis for it. It's purely gratification. It's so uninteresting. It's not even worth really discussing. But that's the way people are. So fearing the worldly punishment, desiring a worldly benefit. That's the next one. So people also desire benefits. This is the most basic human foundation, is stick and carrot. It's how children are disciplined, stick and carrot. It's how society works, stick and carrot. Really, much of society is based on these principles. So the reason you obey the law is usually fear of punishment. And that's why the highest people, the most intelligent people, are the ones that transcend those fear and carrot factors, and they move into another realm. But the majority of people are at that level, and that's the Quran speaks to the Prophet said, "Siru ala sayri ad'afikum," move according to the level of the least amongst you. So you have to move with the least amongst you. You don't speed up and leave people behind. No. And that's the way Islam, if you look at this religion, most of it is designed to protect the weakest people. There are a lot of things. Most people, there are people that can be alone with other people. There's no problem. There's people that can be alone with children. There's no problem. But there are people that can't. They just have human weaknesses. And so the Sharia protects those people. It's like gambling. The Quran says that there's good in gambling. There's some good in gambling. There's lessons to be learned in gambling. Gambling, risk is an interesting phenomenon. Commerce, there's a lot of relationship between gambling and commerce. But it's a known social science fact that around 3% of everybody that goes into a gambling casino becomes addicted. Destroys their lives. That's why if you go to a gambling casino, you say, how do you know? Because I became Muslim when I was 18, so I shouldn't know anything about this. But I have been inside a gambling casino just to walk around and look. I was driving through Nevada, and it was in the middle of nowhere, and it said food, with one of those flashing lights, and it was a gambling casino. So I went and had lunch. They had a restaurant, but the gambling casino was there next to it. And it was one of the most frightening things. It was like a circle out of Dante's Inferno. And all these people like pulling these things. And I saw one lady she was literally, from emphysema. She had she looked like she was about to die. I mean, she probably like dropped dead pulling the thing, but she was there like with the thing, probably lives in a trailer somewhere. And they had this thing like a pawn shop in the middle of this casino. And it said, we take wedding rings. It was just so sinister. It's what kind of people, how would you justify a job like that, or just depriving people of things? But that's the reality. So that's the way the world is. Gambling is based on the carrot. It's a carrot phenomenon. They think, if I put the money in and pull the lever, and it's all designed so it happens enough times to keep you there. So when people leave, they say, "Oh, I made such and such." They don't tell you how much they lost. They just say, how much they won. So that's the phenomenon of the carrot. It's used a lot, and that's one of the worst things about it. But then, obviously, for the worldly things, those things that are pleasurable are always followed by pain. Always. It has to be. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, حُفَّتَ الْجَنَّةُ بِالْمَكَارِحِ وَحُفَّتَ النَّارُ بِالشَّهَوَاتِ. Paradise was surrounded by distasteful things, and the fire was surrounded by delightful things, pleasurable things. So it's for the aql, the person of intellect, to recognize. And that's why tadabbur, which means to reflect, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ, the Quran uses that word a lot, reflecting. Tadabbur comes from a word to take something to the end. Dubar is the behind of something, it's the end. The adbar is what's behind you. So it's going through something until you get to the end. And that's why when you have tadabbur as a quality, you look down the road. It's like the Iroquois Confederation, one of their principles was whenever they made momentous decisions for the 5 tribes, they would think about how that decision would affect 7 generations. So they would think literally like our children's 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 children down to the 7th generation. How is this decision going to affect us? And doing that is tadabbur. Whereas the person who's stuck in this ajira, they don't get beyond the present. So, and then he says, khawf al-iqab al-ukhrawi, fear of punishment in the next world. So you have fear of worldly punishment because Allah says, if you do things, and one of the things about the Islamic tradition is, and this is true of the Abrahamic tradition, and it's really true of the Indic and the Asian tradition, like Buddhism and Hinduism certainly have these ideas. But there is an idea that just as you have physics, you also have metaphysics. So physics are laws that we can discern from the palpable world, the world that we can touch and feel. There are laws. There's laws of cause and effect. If you do something in the world, an action has a reaction. So if I hit something, I get a sound. If I hit that and there was no sound, there's a suspension of a physical law. We'd have to look into it, of why that's happening. I mean, there could be some machine that's designed to stop that, because now they know how to stop sound by sending in counter waves that cancel out the sound. But when you do that, you get a sound. So there's laws of physics. If you jump off a building, there's going to be an effect from that cause. So in the same way, there's metaphysical laws. There are laws of cause and effect that transcend the physical world and move into the spiritual world, the psychic world. There's like, if I shout at you, there's a psychic effect. Where are emotions? We don't really understand emotions because it's part of consciousness. But if I shout at you, you feel something inside. You become depressed, or you become angry. That's another realm. That's not a physical realm. You're in the realm of the emotions, and we don't really understand that realm fully. I mean, it's certainly got something to do with our central nervous system, because we know that when you get depressed, you get certain hormones are affected. There's neuropeptides. There's physical effects, but there's something else about it that doesn't feel physical. Your state changes. There's an aura about you that other people see. You can see somebody's not well. Like, why are you so sad? There's a whole change in their personality. So, and then there's spiritual effects. So, for instance, the Arabs call something ma' al-wajh, which is, it literally means water of the face. But the idea is, it's something that people have on their face it's like a purity in the face. And Qis ibn Sa'ida was asked what muru'ah was. Muru'ah is like human dignity. And he said, it's an yuhafiz al-mar'u ala ma'i wajhihi. It's that a man protects the water in his face. In other words, that purity in his face, he protects it. So people who sin a lot, it begins to show up on their faces. And you get a type of a metaphysical darkness in the face. And then people that do a lot of good deeds, their faces, and that's why their faces are affected by that. The Arabs call the face al-sahifa. It's one of the names of the face. The actual, which means the sahifa is like it's the registrar. It's what registers everything. Somebody once said, by 50, everybody has the face they deserve. If you're 50 years old, you have the face you deserve. If you've had a good life, it's going to show up on your face. That fear of an otherworldly punishment is one of the things that will compel a person to do good and to stay within these boundaries. And then raja'u thawab al-ukhrawi, which is a desire or a hope for otherworldly rewards. And then the next one he says is fear of a reckoning, that you're going to be reckoned on the Day of Judgment. And so the fear of reckoning should instill in you a desire. You see, anybody who has a business, they have what's called internal audits. If you have a business and you live in a country like the U.S. or England, where they have revenue services that will come and they'll examine your businesses. And if you've been fudging the books, if you haven't been, you get penalties. It's not just your back taxes. No, they add penalties and interest, and they do all these things. So companies that are worried about that, they're worried about that fear of that external reckoning or auditing by the revenue service, they do an internal audit. So if there's anything that needs correcting, they correct it internally. Well, that's called muhasabah. And it's part of taqwa, where you actually take yourself to account. The hadith says, "Hasibu qabla an tuhasabu." Take yourself to account before you're taken to account. And then he says, well, also shame or modesty from the awareness of God, that Allah is aware of you, that Allah is watching you. So having this shame or modesty, and the word al-haya'u in Arabic, it's probably better translated modesty, and modesty is related to shame. There's a sense that you don't want to do something in front of a person or in front of your Lord out of respect for that person. There's certain things children won't do in front of their parents. In Mauritania, you can never bring up, for instance, if you're married to somebody, they don't talk in front of the spouse's parents. Just out of modesty. This is their culture. It's not an Islamic thing. It's a cultural thing. But that's a type of modesty, because the idea that their spouse is the son or the daughter of this person and they're living together, and so there's a type of modesty that goes with that. The Prophet ﷺ said, لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقَ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءُ. Every religion has a characteristic, and the characteristic of my religion is modesty. It's modesty. Anthropologists divide cultures into two types: shame cultures and guilt cultures. Guilt cultures are, Western cultures tend to fall into the guilt culture. A guilt culture cultivates in people a moral component inside of themselves, where if they do something wrong, they feel bad about it inside. And so one of the things a lot of people note about people in the West is you have people often will find it very difficult to do things without feeling bad. So guilt, in fact, there's a whole industry in America to help people overcome guilt. You can go to self-help books and things. There's a whole industry to help people overcome guilt. So in guilt cultures, there's internal mechanisms. In shame cultures, the mechanisms are external. And so people don't do wrong out of fear of others. They don't do wrong out of fear of others, which generally creates hypocrisy in cultures. When you don't have an internal component, when there's only external factors. So when the person is in his country and it's shameful to do certain things, but then they go to another country and it's not shameful there to do those same things, that they start doing them and they don't feel anything. It's just completely acceptable because they're no longer in the culture where to do that thing shameful. Also the anonymity of a city. When people move into cities where because in a village, everybody knows you, they know your parents, they know so if you do anything, the whole town's going to hear about it. In a city, there's an anonymity. So it's difficult to sense that shame, which is why guilt cultures are very important in advanced societies. When you have advanced society, shame works very well at the tribal level. It works very well in small cultures. When you move to big cultures, it breaks down. Now, I'll tell you something amazing about the haram. This is a true story. There was a man from Turkey. He was a DJ. You know what a DJ is? A disc jockey in a discotheque in Europe. He literally played records it was a big discotheque. And that was his job. Well, he decided to make Umrah. And when he came in, the echo bothered him so much. in the haram when he was hearing the imam. And so he went to some of the Saudi officials, and he said, you have a big problem. And he said, we know, and we've spent millions trying to solve the problem. They brought the best experts, everything. They couldn't solve the problem. He said, no, it's a very simple problem. I can do it. And he's the man who solved the problem because of his expertise in helping people dance. Isn't that amazing? Yes, subhanAllah. Yeah, that's one of those, interesting little tidbits. Hitler was a vegetarian. All right. When you have a shame culture, it works very well on small scale with tribes, villages. When you move into advanced societies, it breaks down. What Islam does is it transcends. It's shame rooted, but it's not rooted in the shame of people. It's rooted in shame before God. So it's not so much of an internal factor, it's an external, it's more shame-based, but it has to do with this modesty before God and before His angels. Because you have two angels on each side. So the idea is that you become aware of this spiritual presence that should prevent you from doing things. So that's what he's talking about, of being, and that's called maqam al-muraqabah. It's a very high station, which is the station of vigilance or awareness of God, based on His word. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ رَقِيبًا. Allah sees everything, is aware of everything. And then the next is gratitude over the blessings of God by being obedient. In other words, every blessing that you have, if God gave you sight, the gratitude for that sight is to use it for the sake of God. If He gave you hearing, the gratitude is to use it for the sake of God. If He gave you physical strength, to use it. Everything should be used for what it was made for. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not create His creation and desired for them disobedience. He enables disobedience, which is called khidlan. So Allah is the enabler. Allah enables disobedience. We believe that in the qadr. But Allah says that He is not content with it. لا يرضى الكفر لعباده. He does not want His servants to be in a state of ingratitude. But He enables that. So it's very important to have gratitude for the blessings by using those blessings in obedience. وَالشُّكْرُ صَرْفَ الْعَبْدِ مَا أَوْلَاهُ مَوْلَاءٌ مِّن نِعْمَاهُ فِي رِضَاهُ. Imam Ibn Juzayy says shukr is وَالشُّكْرُ صَرْفَ الْعَبْدِ مَا أَوْلَاهُ. It is the utilization of the gifts of the servant that have been given to him by God, مَوْلَاهُ مِن نِعْمَاهُ فِي رِضَاهُ, from the blessings that He's given him in what He's pleased with, what God's pleased with. So that is the definition of shukr, is to use the gifts that Allah has given you in things that are pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he said and then the next is knowledge. So knowledge actually becomes a reason to have taqwa, al-ilm. Because Allah says, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. Those who have this khashya, which is like taqwa, it's a type of fearful awareness of God and awe before God that comes from knowledge. Because amongst His servants, it's the ulama that do this. And then the magnification of Allah's majesty, ta'aleem jalalillah. And this is called maqam al-hayba. It's the station of awe, that you're in awe. Hayub. Mahib is somebody that you have awe for. Like the sultan, there's an awe that goes with it. When you go visit a sultan, there's a whole way that they have made things in order to instill in the ruler this awe. They do it. If you go to the White House, there's these Marine guards and they've got big bayonets, and there's a reason why the bayonet's on there. They could just have the gun, but the bayonet, and that's the same with the swords. That it creates a type of haiba. And then you go in and there's dahalis, there's these corridors, and then there's these cupolas and all these marble and things, and then they spin you around when you go. They all do it, They do it in Washington, they do it in Riyadh, they do it in England, wherever you go, they have the same type of rituals. They're going to be different based on the culture, but they're the same type of rituals. And they're all designed to create an awe in the sultan, which is important, because if the sultan has no awe, then why should people obey him? That you need that to have that. And that's even part of why traditionally the ulama dress certain ways. Like Imam Abu Hanifa said, tell the ulama, wasi'u akmamuhum. They should wear big robes, and that's why they wear the jubba, like you put on the jubba. That's all part of that, to give a certain haiba. You put the kiswa on the Kaaba. If you take the kiswa off, when you take that kiswa, it's part of the reason why women are veiled also, is to give them a type, because they're called, a woman is called hurma, which is like a sanctuary. It's something inviolable, something that should not be, it should be protected. It shouldn't be harmed. And so that's part of the wisdom behind that, is that when you veil her, it gives her a type of awe, which is why nuns have that same thing. Traditionally, the habit was something that gave them, oh, that's an inviolable woman. That's somebody that should not be. That's a very important aspect of this ta'zeem. And then also it's sidq al-mahabba, this sincerity in one's love for God gives one taqwa. And that's why one of the poets said, Mahmud al-Warraq said, ta'asi ilaha, you disobey Allah, wa tudhiru hubbahu, and you feign obedience or love of God. You feign love of God. So you disobey God, but you're feigning love of God. And then he says, هذا محال في القياس بديع. This is impossible, and it's a new type of logic. It's a new type of logic. And in one riwayah, هذا لعمرك في الفعال شنيع. This, by your life, is something just distasteful. لو كان حبك صادقا لأطعته. Had your love been sincere, you would have been obedient. إن المحب لمن يحب مطيع. Because a lover always obeys his or her beloved. So the nature of love is that you want to obey the one you love. So, and then وَلِلَهِ دَرَّ الْقَائِلْ أيضا. May the milk has flown from God for this person, for God, as an Arabic expression. Lillahi darruhu. The dar is the milk from the breast, and it was for God. The idea is that the child was raised in a pure. So it's one of the Arab expressions just to say, what an excellent thing. So he says, وَقَائِلَةٌ قَدْ سَأَلَتْ عَنْ حَالِ عَاشِقِهَا. A woman asked about the state of the one in this burning passion for her. So the ashiq is the one, the ishq. They say that in Urdu, ishq. The ashiq is the one that they're burning up with passion. And they say, dawa al-ishq al-ittisab. The only cure for ishq is to be connected, the embrace. So, she's asking this man about her lover. And this is what lovers do. Oh, what would they say? What's... Lillahi sifhu, describe him. Wala tanqus wala tazidi. And don't stint in your description and don't exaggerate. I want to hear the truth. So then he says, لو كان رهن الموت من ظمأ. If he thought he would die from thirst, وَقُلْتِ قِفْ عَنْ وُرُودَ الْمَاءِ لَمْ يَرِدِ. And you said, don't touch that water, he wouldn't touch it. So if he's going to die of thirst, and the woman said, don't touch that water, he wouldn't touch it. He'd rather die than disobey. So the point of that, what they're emphasizing there, is that the nature of love is obedience. So the more you love God, the more you obey God. And that's the idea. So those are the reasons that he gives for al-bawa'ith, the motivating factors of taqwa. الفصل الثالث درجة التقوى وهي خمس. So the third section is the degrees of taqwa, and there are 5 degrees of taqwa. What's that? There were 10. So fear of a worldly punishment, hope for a worldly benefit, fear of an otherworldly punishment, hope for an otherworldly benefit, fear of a reckoning, modesty from the glance of God, and that's the station of muraqabah. And then gratitude for the blessings of God by using them in His obedience, and knowledge, and then exalting or magnifying the majesty of God, and that's the station of haiba, and sincere love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So did everybody get them? What's that? Okay. So he says there are 10. The first one is fear, so that's 1. Fear of a worldly punishment. 2, hope for an otherworldly, for a worldly benefit. 3, fear of a otherworldly punishment. 4, hope for a otherworldly reward. 5, fear of a reckoning. 6, modesty from the look of God or the glance of God, this shame before God. 7 is gratitude towards God. 8 is knowledge, from knowledge of God, that you have taqwa. 9 is magnifying the majesty of God, which is haiba. And then 10 is sincerity in your love for God. So the third section is that there are 5 degrees of taqwa. أن يتقي العبد الكفر وذلك مقام الإسلام، وأن يتقي المعاصي والمحرمات وهو مقام التوبة، وأن يتقي الشبهات وهو مقام الورع، وأن يتقي المباحات وهو مقام الزهد، وأن يتقي حضور غير الله عز وجل في قلبه وهو مقام المشاهدة، وبالله التوفيق وهو حسبي ونعم الوكيل. So the 5 degrees of taqwa, and this is something that Ibn Juzayy is famous for. He derived these from the Quran. These are the 5 levels of taqwa. Now the beauty of this is the first level of taqwa, the first degree, is a fear of kufr. And for that reason, every Muslim is considered a muttaqi. You know, hudal lil muttaqeen, and then also rahmati wasi'at kulla shay wa sa'aktubuha lilladhina yattaqun. My mercy has encompassed all things, but I have given it specifically to the people of taqwa. So everybody gets it, but in the akhirah it's for the people of taqwa. So every Muslim is a muttaqi. If you're a Muslim and you're afraid of kufr, you have a degree of taqwa, even if you're doing disobedient things. So that's the first level. The next level is that you fear disobedience and the muharramats. And that's the maqam of tawbah. So now you're a Muslim, but you're afraid of doing sin. So you begin to make tawbah when you do sins. Astaghfirullah, I shouldn't have done this. And this rises in degrees. It gets finer and finer. And to the point where they say, Hasanatul abrar sayyatul muqarrabin, that the good deeds of righteous people are the bad deeds of people in the divine presence. So things that you think are good deeds, for the people in divine presence, they're actually misdeeds for them. So there's a lot of subtle things about things. You don't notice subtle, hidden shirk and things. You just don't notice them. You don't realize you're doing something, you know, and there's a portion of it that's for other people. You might not even be aware of it, because a lot of these things are very subtle. And that's called maqam al-tawbah. And then وَأَن يَتَّقِيَ الشُّبُهَاتِ وَمَقَامَ الْوَرَعِ, and then you begin to fear doubtful matters, and that's called wara', the station of wara', when you fear doubtful things. So you begin to fear doing something, you know, like if you work in an office, taking a pen home from the office. You know, people do those things, they don't even think about it. But it's not their property. It's the property of the office. Or, for instance, you know, like I was telling yesterday, I said to some people who are friends and guests here, I said, you know, come over, are you paying for your food at the hotel? And they said, yes. And I said, well, inshallah, come over and join us, you know. And I said, no, wait, let me check to make sure it's all right. Because we could just go in, we could bring somebody in from Dar al-Salam, but we didn't pay for that food because they have a certain number of people, even though there's plenty of food. And I want to remind people not to waste food. I'd rather you take less than you need and finish it and then go back for seconds. You're in Medina. It's bad enough in other places. It troubles me more than anything in my house to see food. Compost is good and things like that. And I always go out, and if we throw anything, we go out and give it to the animals. But to waste food is one of the major sins of modern people, because food used to be very scarce. It's not anymore in a lot of places. In many places it still is, but in a lot of places not. But the blessing of food, the magnification of the blessing of food is very important. So when you're here, don't waste the food. If they're going to waste it, that's on them. But when you take a plate, your eye, the Arabs say the eye is more hungry than the stomach. You see this food and and you're hungry, so you put a whole bunch on. After a little bit, you're full. And then you've got half the plate is filled with food. So just be aware of that. There's people, when we were in Ta'if, we told them, please stop bringing us all this food. And the man came in with a garbage can. I said, I don't want to waste this food. And he's a Bangladeshi man. He said to me, I came to this country from my village in Bangladesh for food. And he said, I do this every day. He said, it bothers me. Because I think about my village and the people there. I mean, it's real. So just here, you take what you need. But anyway, my point about that was that I can't do that, because that's not even a shubha. That's just clearly not permitted. So it's very important to be aware of those things. And then the next one is وَأَنْ يَتَقِي الْمُبَحَاتِ, that he fears permitted things. And this is called maqam al-zuhd. And this comes from the statement of Imam Ali, al-halal hisab wal-haram iqab. What's halal is reckoning, and what's haram is retribution. So whatever you have that's halal, you're going to be reckoned. ثُمَّ لَتُسْأَلُنَّ يَوْمَئِذٍ عَنِ النَّعِيمِ. On that day you'll be asked about na'im. Like for instance, last night was na'im that we're going to be asked about. Because Allah doesn't give gifts without expectation from the human being, which is gratitude, shukr. And shukr is to do more. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, the Prophet once said about him, somebody asked about him, he said, نِعْمَ الْعَبْدُ لَوْ قَامَ اللَّيْلِ. What a good man if he only would get up at night. Right? They said Ibn Umar never left night prayers after that statement. And Imam al-Muhasibi says the sign of a sincere person is when they're praised, they actually do more. And the sign of a hypocrite is when they're praised, they do less. Because that's what they wanted. They wanted the praise. Whereas for the sincere person, they said that Bishr al-Hafi, somebody once said, he was passing by and he heard one man say, that's Bishr al-Hafi. He spends the whole night in prayer. And he didn't, but after that he did. Because he didn't want people saying about him what wasn't true. That's ikhlas in action. And I thought it was very interesting what he said last night. It was an interesting talk, and I'm sorry some people couldn't hear it. But, it's very difficult to raise your voice. Even though it's permitted, by Sharia, I can't bring myself to do it, because I've spoken in there a few times now. The ayah says, don't raise your voice in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. So I'm sorry for people who didn't hear the talk, but one of the things that he said was that, that God has chosen you, that you have to see it that way, that you're here for a specific reason, and he's saying that he thinks that it's because you have to deliver this message to where you are, because those people haven't heard the message, and he said that you should be doing more to educate people about Islam, to those people that don't know about Islam. And I really feel there's a lot of truth. Because he told me, and he told us last night, they've never done that. They've never seen, none of those people have ever seen that before. They said, the way we were treated is the way they treat kings or rulers of countries. And he said, كلهم بمرتبة عندنا ملك أو رئيس دولة. He said each one of these people is for us tonight, it's like the king or the head of a country, because he said they only call us here at night for that. So we've never seen this before. So, and part of it, I think, Allahu Alam, is just about the West. There's a tawajjuh to the West, and people have to recognize that you have a big responsibility. This should be a turning point in your life for commitment and for what you want to do with the rest of your life. It should be a turning point in your life. These journeys they're not for enjoyment, there's enjoyment in them. There's no doubt about that. There's pleasure, there's company, there's companionship. He said one of the benefits is just the Amir said that yesterday. One of the benefits is the bonding that happens on these journeys. People bond, and you'll have friends here that you might have for the rest of your life. So, but you should also, this is a commitment, because we're coming here to honor the Deen and to honor our Prophet ﷺ, to draw closer to him, to learn more about him, to see where he went, to see what he did, but also to recognize we're his followers. He's our Imam. And the Prophet is our Imam, and he spent his life for the sake of God. That was his life. He could have had the world and what was in it. He could have been a prophet king like Sulaiman. He could have had palaces, concubines, everything that Sulaiman had and more. But he didn't choose that. His way was the way of zuhud, the way of sacrifice, the way of giving up himself for others. That's his way. That's the way of our Prophet ﷺ. Our Prophet is completely committed to others, irrespective of their religion, of their race, of whatever. His commitment is to humanity. And then finally, وَأَنْ يَتَّقِي حَضُورَ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ فِي قَلْبِهِ, that you have a taqwa, a fearful awareness that anything other than the presence of God should enter your heart. That's the highest. That's maqam al-arifin, are people that don't allow other than God to come into their heart. It doesn't happen. And that's the highest. And he says, وَبِاللَّهِ تَوْفِيقُ وَحَسْبِهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ. The next section, and I'll finish with this section, I think. What time am I supposed to end? Oh, mashallah, all right. Does anybody have any questions about that last section? The maqam is taqwa hudur ghayrillah. It's fear of that other than Allah should come into the heart. Yeah. Any question about that section? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he said al-halal hisab wal-haramu iqab. That what is halal is reckoning and what's prohibited is retribution. So whatever you do that's halal, you're going to be taken into account for it. And whatever you do that's haram, you have the possibility of retribution. Allah can forgive whom He pleases. So it's the point of that is that in maqam al-zuhud, Sidi Ahmed Zarruq said that zuhud was that your trust in God was greater than what you had in your hand. So if you have money, it's like, Joha, Mullah Nasiruddin. He was on the way to the souk, and somebody said, Joha, where are you going? He said, I'm going to the souk to buy some meat. And the man said, say inshallah. And he said, why? I have the money in my pocket. The marketplace is right there. So he went, and on the way somebody stole his money. So on the way back, the man said, where's the meat? And he said, somebody stole my money, inshallah. So even though you have the means, your trust in God is greater than your trust in your means. That's zuhud. So that's why a zahid doesn't mean that you don't have a nice house, you don't have a nice car, you don't wear nice clothes. A zahid is not necessarily the man who's wearing the patched robe. That's an older understanding of zuhud. But the better understanding that Sidi Ahmed Zarruq mentions is that real zuhud is that the stuff is not in your heart. That you can possess things, but they don't possess you. Yeah, no, that's good too, yeah. Because the honor is the inverse of shame. The idea that you do something because it's the appropriate thing to do, what the Greeks called arete, what the Muslims call ihsan, and also the idea of irb. One of the things that Islam protects is honor. And that's why many things, you can't accuse people of things out of protection of their honor. You can't, the reason you don't steal is to honor other people's property. So when you have a sense of honor, it's a good point. When you have a sense of honor, it's the honor that prevents you. And that sense of honor more than shame. And that's generally in if you want a classical hierarchical worldview, that was generally considered much more present in people of noble lineage and good families, and there's a lot of mention of that. Sidi Ahmed Zarruq talks about people of good lineage, good families, and the Prophet indicated this, that there are good families and bad families. He talked about, beware of the rose out of a cow path. And they said to the Prophet, what is the rose out of the cow path? And he said, a beautiful woman from a bad house. So you can be very attracted to the form, but if and that applies equally to men as well, for the women. The Prophet, much of the language of, you have to understand, it's a very important point to understand, much of the language of the Prophet, because he was speaking to men generally, and in usul you have what's called mafhum and mukhalafa and darir al-khitab, that you also have to understand it the other way as well. That's implied in the statement. So for women, it's obviously to the man, and that's implied. It's not a sexist type of language. It's actually in our usuli tradition that if the Prophet says something, it also has to be understood from the other perspective as well. But because he was generally speaking to men, he had a day out of the week that was specifically to the women, but generally he was speaking to the men, so he would use the language that was appropriate for the men with the understanding that the inverse was true for the women. Mm-hmm. He never did what? Sorry? Right. You can't do things that weren't done at his time. It's an usuli question, and there's a lot of detail to it. That's like a research paper. But the short of it is that there are two opinions in usul. Imam Malik takes the more cautious position, which is if the Prophet did not do something, he does not do it when it relates to worship. The other position is the position of Imam Shafi'i, in which what's called tark, the fact that the Prophet did not do something, he did not consider a prohibition, and if it was from the religion a good thing, then it becomes a virtue or a fadila. Now, the Prophet ﷺ there are many things that he didn't do that we do. For instance, I have a watch. If I'm outside and I know that they pray at 3:30 in the masjid, or 4:30 for Asr, it's at 4:10. So I look at my watch, it's 4 o'clock. I say, I have to go to the masjid. Well, that's a bid'ah. Because no Sahabi looked at a watch to determine the prayer time. All right? It's an innovation. But it has an accuracy that is highly probable, not as accurate as the sun by any means. Because if you look at the sun and the shadow and things like that, the watch could be wrong. It could be slow, it could be fast, etc. So there are things that we do that the Sahaba didn't do, and we don't even think about them. We just take them for granted. But generally, in the hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha, the Imam Nawawi relates in the 40 hadith, "Man ahdatha fi amrina hada ma laysa minhu fahuwa raddun." Whoever brings into this religion something novel that is not from the religion, it's rejected. So that little phrase, ma laysa minhu, is very important. He didn't say, man ahdatha fi amrina hadha fahuwa raddun. He said, whoever brings into something in this religion that doesn't have a foundation in the religion, it is rejected. And that's why many of the things that were brought in, like for instance, what we're doing here, this isn't, the rihla, doing this. And it has a basis in our tradition, but we're staying in a 5-star hotel, there's a lot of things that we could say are problematic or doubtful, things like that. This could be seen as extravagance. So when you begin to look at things, there's a lot of things. On the other hand, one of the signs of the end of time is there will be a lot of wealth, there will be a lot of things that people did not have in the past. Some of the later scholars said that people at the end of time, that wealth is more important than in the tradition. It was better to be of lower means because of the dangers of wealth. But many of the later scholars said, no, it's better for people to have, that was the position of Abu Hasan al-Shadhili, because his time already there was more wealth in the communities. He lived in a very affluent society, and he said it's not appropriate for the people of God to be people that other people look down on. Because in the past, people didn't have the type of contempt they had for poverty. But in an age where it's very easy to gain access to wealth in ways that it wasn't in the past, poverty becomes a contemptible thing. And so people look down on poor people. They treat them like they're insignificant. So you don't want the religious people for people to look at them like that. You want them to be exemplars. People want to be like them. So that's another, that's one of the things about this time, that poverty is something that has become, it's not honored anymore in the way that it was. I have fatwas in one Sharisi's book. There are fatwas that it was permissible for rich people to dress like poor people when they went on journeys because of the respect that brigands showed to the dervishes. Like when people, highway robbers, when they would see the dervish, if they thought he was a religious mendicant, they wouldn't touch them because they were like, those are people of God, don't mess with them. So they actually gave the rich people permission to pretend to be fuqara. It's not like that anymore. The times change, things change. But in terms of things like the Mawlid, it's a khilaf, and it's a valid khilaf. The majority of Muslims supported it. It started in the 7th century. The majority of Muslims supported it. Imam Suyuti supported it. And they supported it from hadith based on the fact that the Sahaba definitely recognized the virtue of Rabi' al-Awwal. The fact the Prophet was born on Monday, that he made his hijrah on his birthday, he died on his birthday. He arrived in Medina. So all these things, why would God make all those coincidences if there wasn't some significance to that date? And he also, in Sahih Muslim, he was asked if Monday was a good day to fast. He said, I was born on that day. In other words, of course it's a good day. I was born on that day. That's in Sahih Muslim. So just every Monday is a good day. In the West, it's a depressing day. For us, it's a happy day. Thank God it's Monday. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, we ended that section. That's why I opened it up. Uh-huh. Yeah, on Monday, because that's a sound tradition too. Because the Wayba, he freed a slave girl because he was so happy the Prophet was born, and he gets a lightening of his punishment for that reason. So the ulama said that was his happy birthday present, to free a slave, and Allah honored him for that by giving him drink. So, extravagance, yeah. No, I think it's a good point. I think it's related to your socioeconomic status. People that are very wealthy, it's relative, but they should be doing a lot more. I was just telling Yahya, some Mauritanian man came up to me in the masjid, and he knew me, and he teaches Quran here, and he was talking about helping the widows and orphans, which I'm glad I brought this up because I want to. Do you have one of those bags, Faraydun? In fact, you could pass it around now. If people want, there's people that I know here that distribute money amongst the, poor people here that are good, that don't ask. Because there's poor people that don't ask anybody. Those are the best people to give to. I mean, here there's a lot of professional beggars, unfortunately. And there really are. There are professional beggars here. There are people that come every Hajj and make their yearly earning. They do. I'm not joking. I mean, I've seen amazing things. I was on Hajj once, and this man came and he pulled up his ihram, and there was like a surgical thing, and there was blood, and he was like, fi sabilillah, and I'm like all ready to give everything I have. And this Mauritanian that I was with, who used to work on the Hajj, he just pulled them, and it really shocked me, and he pulled it up and he ripped it off, and it was just a plastic thing. I swear to God, I saw it with my own eyes. I couldn't believe it. This guy was just lying. So, and I was once with Faraydun, with Tarif Urabi, and this man came up to me. He had turban, nice face. He came up and he gave this incredible sob story about he went to Quba and he lost $3,000. And he pulled up he had a little bag and showed how it was cut from the bottom. And he pulled it open and he's like, an amazing expression. I mean, these guys, Academy Award performances, really. Tarif took everything in his pocket. You can ask Tarif Urabi for people that know him. He took this wad and just Bismillah. And then he looked at me and I just said, A'udhu Billah. First of all, you shouldn't be asking in the Masjid of the Prophet because it's Imam Malik said don't ask. And he spoke Arabic, and then he started saying Arabiya ma fi ma'lum. Like when he told us the story, he was speaking Arabic, and then when I started rebuking him, suddenly Arabiya ma fi ma'lum. And I just said to him, don't go outside and ask. If you want to beg, go outside. People are here trying to worship Allah, please. And Buddy looked at him, and he was like, Shaykh Hamza, poor man. And I said, look, Buddy, first of all, he's a liar. That's a lie. All right. And he couldn't believe it, like, how do you know he's lying? No, I mean, that sounded really, I said, as we were walking out, and Allah is my witness, a man came up to us, another man. Assalamu alaikum. I was in Quba. He pulled up his thing with the thing. Wallahi, I swear to God. And Tarif just said, Amantu billah, So there are professional beggars out here. They're making a lot of money. And, and unfortunately there's some people there that are genuinely needy people. There's no doubt about that. But there are people there, they're con artists. And they're preying on people's goodness and their sincerity, and that's what they do. What's that? The next section is called Babu Dhikri, the chapter on dhikr. This is really an incredibly beneficial section for people, all of us. قال تعالى فاذكروني أذكركم. قال سعيد ابن المسيب معناه اذكروني بالطاعة أذكركم بالثواب، وقيل اذكروني بالدعاء والتسبيح ونحو ذلك. وقد أكثر المفسرون لا سيما المتصوفة في تفسير هذا الموضع بألفاظ لها معان مخصوصة ولا دليل على التخصيص. وبالجملة هذه الآية بيان لشرف الذكر، وبيانها قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم فيما يرويه عن ربه: أنا عند ظن عبدي بي وأنا معه إذا ذكرني، فإن ذكرني في نفسه ذكرته في نفسي، وإن ذكرني في ملأ ذكرته في ملأ خير منه. والذكر ثلاثة أنواع: ذكر بالقلب وباللسان وبهما معا. واعلم أن الذكر أفضل الأعمال على الجملة، وإن ورد في بعض الأحاديث تفضيل غيره من الأعمال كالصلاة وغيرها، فإن ذلك لما فيها من معنى الذكر والحضور مع الله تعالى. والدليل على فضيلة الذكر ثلاثة أوجه. So he says, Allah says in the Quran, remember me and I'll remember you. And that's called a conditional sentence, jumla shartiyya. If you do this, I'll do that. So remember me, I'll remember you. Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, who is one of the great tabi'een, and it's preferred that it's al-Musayyib. Sometimes he's called al-Musayyab, but the preferred one is Musayyib. And he said it meant, remember me in obedience and I'll remember you in reward. So if you remember me with obedience, I'll remember you by rewarding you for it. And it said, remember me with dua, with prayer and tasbih and glorification and things like that. And the mufassirun have gone into great detail, especially the mutasawwifa, the people of tasawwuf, in interpreting this particular verse with many different expressions and saying that it has specific meanings, and there's no reason to specify the meaning. It's a general statement, and it should be kept in its most general statement. But if you want my summation, this verse is a clarification, it is a enunciation of the high honor that remembrance has. And it's clearly articulated by the words of the Prophet ﷺ when he related from his Lord in a hadith Qudsi, a sacred hadith, which is where the Prophet speaks as if God is speaking, but it's not Quran. He says, I am in the opinion of my servant with me, whatever my servant thinks about me. And I am with him when he remembers me. If he remembers me in his self, then I remember him in myself. Allah has a nafs. So if he remembers me in his essence, I remember him in my essence. And if he remembers me in a gathering, I remember him in a gathering greater than his gathering. In other words, the malal ala with the angels and all. So he says, dhikr is of three types. Remembrance of the heart, remembrance of the tongue, and a remembrance that contains both remembrance of heart and tongue. So it's the two. Yeah, that goes under the same type thing. Generally, the majority of scholars say you can. There are some scholars that say it's a bid'ah. But yeah, the majority say you can. Yeah, but there's a valid opinion about dhikr, group dhikr, where people actually say dhikr together. Some say it's makruh, some say it's prohibited, but those are very weak opinions. They really are. But when they're there, so they shouldn't be just rejected. Oh, that's rubbish. No, those are valid opinions of valid scholars. But the majority of scholars say it is permissible to gather to do dhikr. Ata ibn Rabah said, he was asked about the hiluq al-dhikr, the gatherings of dhikr, and he said, they're the circles of halal and haram. In other words, learning fiqh, that's the real circles of dhikr. But that's true. That's if you haven't learned that, you shouldn't be doing dhikr, because that's a fard ayn to learn that. So you should learn. It's important to learn. But there are many hadiths about people gathering, reciting the Quran together, gathering, saying La ilaha illallah together. There are many sound hadiths. I mean, they just shouldn't be in the same circle. You know, if there's, you know, if they're not distracted by one another, and I mean, this, you know, we're together, we're mingling and things like that. You know, these things are just out of adab for the way I was taught. You know, people here, we're living in the West, we're in very different circumstances than cultures that are isolated, and not all Muslim cultures are isolated. I mean, some cultures have a segregation between the sexes, others don't. In most historical Muslim countries, there was a lot of adab about this, and you know, a lot of reasons for that. In the West, we tend to intermix a lot, and people should still have adab and things like that. You know, I mean, most of you have studied in university. You've studied sitting next to men and women. You know, I mean, we've all done that, and it didn't destroy us. We didn't turn into, you know, crazy people or something like that. But it's just adab. People, the Prophet ﷺ was on Hajj, and one of his relatives, a woman came up. She was very beautiful, and in the Hajj you don't, and Abbas's cousin was like just staring at her. This is on Hajj, and he's in front of the Prophet ﷺ, she was very beautiful. And that's what the hadith says. She had a beautiful face. So the Prophet took his head and turned it the other way. He says that the Prophet ﷺ related from his Lord, Ana inda dhanni abdi bi, Ana inda dhanni. Do you want in English? Yeah. I am in the opinion that my servant has of me. And I am with him when he remembers me. This is called ma'iyat al-dhikr. That God says he's with you when it's in Sahih Muslim, so it's a sound hadith. So I am with my servant when he remembers me. And if he remembers me in his own self, I remember him in mine. And if he remembers me in a group, I remember him in a group better than the group he remembers me. So, and then he says there are three types of dhikr. Dhikr with the heart, dhikr with the tongue, and the two together. So he says, know that dhikr is the best of all actions. If you took all of our actions, dhikr is the best of all actions. Even though there are some hadiths that have been related that say that other things are better, like prayer in its time, which is dhikr, and things like that. And that is because they contain the meaning of remembrance and presence with God. And the proof for the proof that dhikr is the most virtuous thing is from three aspects. The first, الأول النصوص الواردة بتفضيله على سائر الأعمال. The many texts that have been related that prefer it over all other actions. قال صلى الله عليه وسلم ألا أنبئكم بخير أعمالكم وأزكاها عند مليككم وأرفعها في درجاتكم وخيرا لكم من إنفاق الذهب والفضة في سبيل الله وخير لكم من أن تلقوا عدوكم فتضربوا أعناقهم ويضربوا أعناقكم قالوا بلى يا رسول الله قال ذكر الله وسئل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أي الأعمال أفضل قال ذكر الله قيل له الذكر أفضل أم الجهاد في سبيل الله فقال لو ضرب المجاهد بسيفه في الكافر حتى ينقطع سيفه ويختضب دما لكان الذاكر أفضل منه. So the first reason is all of these hadiths that have been related that prefer it over other things. The Prophet ﷺ said in a sound hadith, it's related as a balagh, it's from Abu Darda, the hadith. It's related in the Muwatta, it's mawquf, which means Abu Darda doesn't say he heard it from the Prophet, but generally mawquf of Muwatta is from the Prophet ﷺ. It's marfu' in other texts, so Imam Tirmidhi relates it and others. Can I not tell you the best of all your actions and the purest of it with your king, your sovereign, and the highest in degrees, and better for you than spending your wealth, your gold and silver in the way of God, and better for you than meeting the enemy on battle and striking him and him striking you, or striking his neck, their necks, and them striking your necks? And they said, indeed, tell us, Ya Rasulullah. And he said, dhikrullah, remembrance of God. And once the Prophet ﷺ was asked, which are the best of actions? And he said, remembrance of God, dhikrullah. And then it was said to him, is dhikr better than jihad? Is dhikr better than jihad? Remembrance better than jihad? Fi sabilillah, in the way of God. And he said, even if the mujahid was striking his sword in the kafir until his sword broke and he was covered in blood, the one remembering God would be better than him. Now, the ulama say the reason for that, and that's related by At-Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah, the reason that dhikr is better is because dhikr is an end in and of itself. It's not a means. That we were created for the purpose of remembering God. Jihad is a means. A means is always over an end, is always higher. And some of the ulama say that jihad is better when jihad is necessary, like to defend the lands. You don't sit in the masjid, no, I'm doing dhikr, it's better than the mujahid out there. Do you see? No. You go out and you defend the land, and that's the best. And then he's also stressing the fact that dhikr in your actions, if your actions are devoid of dhikr, then they're not beneficial actions. So if you're out in jihad, struggling in the way of God, then you should be doing dhikr as well. And the Prophet told them to do dhikr, the mujahidun. And it's so difficult now, we talk about jihad and in the environment we're in. It's very sad. But jihad is a very high thing. And our religion is a religion of struggle. It's as simple as that. I mean, somebody said to me, do the Muslims really want to take over the world? I said, no, they're just reacting violently to the fact that we're taking over the world. It's just so strange. You know, America, they want to take over the world. And meanwhile, we're taking over the world. 143 bases around the planet. Really. It's just amazing. So, anyway, no politics. الثاني أن الله تعالى حيثما ذكر الذكر وأمر بالذكر أثنى على الذاكرين واشترط فيه الكثرة وقال اذكروا الله ذكرا كثيرا ولم يشترط ذلك في سائر الأعمال. الثالث أن في الذكر مزية هي له خاصية ليست لغيره وهي الحضور في الحضرة العلية والوصول إلى القرب الذي عبر عنها ما ورد من المجالسة والمعية. فإن الله تعالى يقول أنا جليس من ذكرني ويقول أنا عند الظن عبدي بي وأنا معه إذا ذكرني. So the second is that whenever God mentions dhikr in the Quran or commands people to dhikr, not only does he praise the dhakirin, but he also places the condition of doing much remembrance of it. So he says, udhkurullah, remember Allah, dhikran kathira, abundantly. So do much remembrance of God. And he never says that in any of the other actions he commands us to do. So when he says fast, he doesn't say fast a lot. He doesn't say do jihad a lot. He doesn't say, but when it comes to dhikr, he always says do much dhikr. So if it wasn't the best of actions, there would be no need to emphasize the importance of doing much of it. And then he says also dhikr has a certain quality that is specific to it. And there's no other thing that has this quality, and that is the presence of the highest, the hadra al-aliyya, the highest divine presence. So, and also arrival to nearness to this divine presence that has been articulated in what has come down to us in these texts about being in the company, sitting with, and also being in the company. So Allah says, for instance, Allah the Exalted says, Ana jalisu man dhakarani. I am the companion of the one remembering me. I mean, jalis literally means I'm sitting with. All right, but we don't take that literally. I'm the companion of the one. In other words, I'm with. I'm in that gathering. And also in the hadith that was previously related, I am in the opinion of my servant, whatever my servant thinks. If he remembers me, I'm with him when he remembers me. So the ma'iyya of Allah and the hadra and the presence of God. Now this is where it gets very interesting. وَلِلنَّاسِ فِي الْمَقْصَدِ بِالذِّكْرِ مَقَامًا فمقصد العامة اكتساب الأجور ومقصد الخاصة القرب والحضور وبين المقامين فرق بعيد فكم بين من يأخذ أجره وهو من وراء الحجاب وبين من يقرب حتى يكون من خواص الأحباب هيهات. واعلم أن الذكر على أنواع كثيرة منها التهليل والتسبيح والتكبير والحمدلة والحوقلة والحسبلة وذكر كل اسم من أسماء الله تعالى والصلاة على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم والاستغفار وغير ذلك ولكل ذكر خاصية وثمرة وبالله التوفيق إلى منهج التحقيق وحسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. So amongst the people there are many different reasons, ends or purposes for doing dhikr. In other words, amongst the people and their purposes for doing dhikr, there are two stations. The purpose of common people is to gain rewards. They want rewards. Like if you go in Jama'at Tabligh, they tell you if you do this, you get this. If you do this, you get this. If you do this, if you do this prayer, you get 100. And you could get your calculator out, start adding it up, because there's rewards, and they're in the hadith and they're mentioned. He's saying that is the more general people. They want these rewards. But the end or the purpose of dhikr for the people of distinction, the khasa, is nearness and presence. They want to be near God and feel His presence. And he's saying, what a great difference between these two stations. And what a difference between the one who takes his reward from behind a veil. So you get the reward from behind a veil. And between the one who draws near until he's from amongst the beloveds. So, and then he says, hayhata or hayhatu, hayhat. Hayhat is an Arabic expression, how far off the mark. Hayhata, ba'id. Wa'alam, and then he says, know that dhikr has many different types. There's tahleel, saying la ilaha illallah. Hallilu, in English they say hallelujah. That's where that comes from, hallilu. Really, I'm not making that up. It's in actually Noah Webster's dictionary from 1832. He actually takes it back to Arabic and says it's from the Arabic hallilu, which is to shout for joy. That's why, Christians, hallelujah. It's a shout for joy. Hallilu, hallilu, hallilu. Say la ilaha illallah. That's what it means. I'm not making that up. They just don't know it. We have to teach them. Yeah, so and then tasbih, saying subhanallah. Takbir, saying Allahu Akbar. Hamdallah, saying alhamdulillah. Hawqala, saying la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Hasbullah, saying hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel. And then all the various dhikrs of the names from the names of God. And then finally the prayer on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you have all the dhikrs of Allah, and each one of them is different. And then you have the dhikr, the remembrance of the Prophet, and prayer on the Prophet. And istighfar, asking forgiveness. And those last two, he says for last, because they're the most important ones towards the end of time. That's why the istighfar and salah ala nabi are very important in our time. And then there are other things as well. And he says every dhikr has a property and a fruit. So dhikr is like a seed, and you're watering, and the result, there's a fruit that comes from it. And with Allah's tawfiq to this path of realization, and He's enough for us and the best of protectors. Bab maqam thamarat al-adhkar, the section on the station of the fruits of dhikr. So now he's going to tell us what these dhikrs do for you. Yeah, no, I'm going to talk about that. Yeah. Let me finish the sections, and if I haven't answered the question, because I'm going to answer that question in the section. So if I haven't answered the question in the section, then you can ask the question. But sometimes the question that you have, it's going to come. Because if you had the question, usually the mu'allif has already thought of generally, or the one who's giving the commentary on it, because it's a very valid question. It's related to the topic. Yes, those are the best kind for during this. Yeah, they have the means and the end. Yeah, so it's very high. Yeah, no, there's things about the mujahid that are related that are amazing. So jihad should never be belittled in any way, shape, or form. But a lot of people, what's important to note is there's a lot of people that think that Islam is just about one type of jihad. And so it becomes military, and that's all they can think about. Military that's a certain type of, even the Prophet ﷺ, not all of the Sahaba were of that nature. Most of them were, because the Arabs are military people. I mean, when the Ansar came to the Prophet to do bay'ah, they said, "Nahnu ahl al-harb, abna'u harban wa shawka." We're the sons of war, because their environment was a belligerent environment. Now, when you're in civilized societies, and theirs was not civilized by the standards that we understand today. There was vengeance, there was blood writ, there was, if somebody killed your cousin, you went out and killed anybody from his family. That's how their culture was. If you're in a country like England, for instance, most people are not belligerent. I mean, they might get drunk at the pub and become belligerent. But generally, when you're dealing with people, they're not belligerent. And if you have altercations, they'll solve them in ways that aren't violent. It doesn't mean there aren't violent people amongst them. There are. But the society's norm is not violence. The society's norm is civil. And that's called civil society. And the healthier a society is, the more civil it is. So when you have civil societies and you're focusing always on militaristic qualities and characteristics, something's very seriously wrong. But when you're in an environment under siege, then that emphasis is very important. So the Muslims have to recognize emphasis. Like right now, the most important thing is education. Imam al-Ghazali didn't fight jihad. Even though during his lifetime, Palestine was under occupation. But he thought it's a waste of time to try to free Palestine if you've got a bunch of barbarians that are freeing it. Because they'll just end up killing all the Christians and it'll make Islam look bad. So his focus was on educating the Muslims. And that's why the school system that was laid out during his time produced Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. His generation was produced by Imam al-Ghazali, Sidi Abdul Qadir Jilani. There's no Salahuddin al-Ayyubi without that groundwork that was laid by these intellectual scholars who were re-educating the Ummah to the true principles of Islam. And there are many people who have criticized Imam al-Ghazali and said, why isn't there a Bab al-Jihad in his Ihya? Why didn't he write that back? The whole book, that's the whole point. That whole book, what predicates any type of martial endeavor, you have to have spiritual people. And that's why the Sahaba weren't allowed to fight for 14 and a half years. They weren't allowed to fight. It was all purification. They were being prepared because you don't want people that are vengeful and violent. You don't want those people fighting because they won't care about people. Even some of the ulama said only reason that war was the only repository for slaves. All other forms of slavery were abolished in Islam. Before Islam, you were born a slave, you indentured servitude, if you got into debt, you became a slave. You could be just captured, kidnapped. There were a lot of different ways. Like now, they have all these types of slavery out there. But Islam only allowed slavery from war. That's the last. And some of them said the whole point was because when people are fighting and they think that going to be slaves, they don't want to kill the people. They actually want them to live. So it's actually a mercy for the people that you're fighting because, what a waste. Well, he's talking about a much more of this is like serious meditation. It's a state. If you have a good niyyah, like you go to work as a physician and you make a niyyah, I want to serve humanity for the sake of God, then they're rewarded for that. But he's talking about a spiritual presence that's in the heart, that literally you are aware of God. So for instance, in our aqidah, when the surgical knife cuts, we don't believe that the knife is cutting. We believe God is actually creating a new event. And that the knife is only a sabab, but it doesn't literally have any power. So if the surgeon is witnessing that in himself, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about mushahada, that somebody's really in a spiritual awareness of God. Nafs means essence. Like nafsi is my essence. So when Allah, in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, at the end of Ma'idah, أَنْتَ تَعْلَمُ مَا فِي نَفْسِكَ وَلَا أَعْلَمُ مَا فِي نَفْسِكَ. Jesus says, you know what's in my nafs, and I don't know what's in your nafs. So a prophet would never say about God something that wasn't accurate. So Allah has a nafs, but it means essence. Because nafs has a lot of meaning. So it doesn't mean like ego. Like we use nafs as a negative term generally, right? When we talk about nafs, like he's just got a nafsitis, inflammation of nafs, right? acute case of nafsitis. Right? So he says, this is the section, فَأَمَّا التَّهْلِيلُ فَثَمْرَةُ التَّوْحِيدِ أعني التوحيد الخاص فإن التوحيد العام حاصل لكل مؤمن. See, he's answering your questions. وأما التكبير فثمرته التعظيم وإجلال لذي الجلال. وأما الحمدلة والأسماء التي معناها الإحسان والرحمة كالرحمن والرحيم والكريم والغفار وشبه ذلك فثمرتها ثلاثة مقامات وهي الشكر وقوة الرجاء والمحبة فإن المحسن محبوب لا محالة. وأما الحوقلة والحسبلة فثمرتها توكل على الله وتفويض إلى الله والثقة بالله. وأما الأسماء التي معانيها الاطلاع والإدراك كالعليم والسميع والبصير والرقيب وشبه ذلك فثمرتها المراقبة. وأما الصلاة على النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فثمرتها شدة المحبة فيه والمحافظة على اتباع سنته. وأما الاستغفار فثمرته والاستقامة على التقوى والمحافظة على شروط التوبة مع انكسار القلب بسبب الذنوب المتقدمة. ثم إن ثمرات الذكر بجميع الأسماء والصفات مجموعة في الذكر الفرد وهو قولنا الله 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 فذلك هو الغاية وإليه المنتهى فدونك أيها السالك وبالله التوفيق حسبنا ونعم الوكيل. So he says, as for the tahleel, saying la ilaha illallah, the fruit of that is tawheed, is unity. But I mean by this the distinct tawheed. I don't mean common tawheed. As for this common tawheed, every believer has that. So he's talking about the tawheed of seeing Allah cut, not the knife. That's the, if you do much la ilaha illallah, you will begin to experience true unity in the world. That you actually perceive everything happening in the world from God. ما تسقط ورقة إلا يعلمها. Not even a leaf falls without the knowledge of God. So it's being aware of God, seeing the Master's hand in every grain of sand, seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His creation. That it's all a fi'l of God. The whole of existence is a divine action. It's an action of God. It's only happening because God is making it happen. And He's making it happen in every instant. So He's not divorced from His creation in that, like a machine that He just created, the clock, and then it ticks away without Him. No. He is actively participating in the event of the world. He is the muhdith. He is the one making things happen. He is fa'al. He's the one doing everything. And that is what the tawheed will give you. Tawheed khas is that you see the divine unity in everything. It's not that the world is God. The world is contingent. The world is, it's not an illusion, and it's not an illusion. Like, we're not Hindus. We don't believe in Maya in this, but we do understand that there is an element of waham in the world. The world does not have any substantial existence. It's qa'imun billah. It's only here because Allah is enabling it to be here in every instant. And if He withdrew His qayyumiyyah, His sustaining power, the universe disappears. So it's being aware of that. That's what he's talking about. وَأَمَّا التَّكْبِيرُ فَالثَّمْرَةُ تَعْظِيمٌ وَإِجْلَالُ لِذِي الْجَلَالِ. And as for saying Allahu Akbar, what results in it is feeling the magnification of Allah, that Allah is great, and having this sense of majesty of God in your heart. As for saying Alhamdulillah, and also the names of God that have the meanings of generosity, of giving, of mercy, like Rahman, Rahim, the merciful, the compassionate, the Kareem, the generous, the Ghaffar, the forgiver, and those types of names, the fruit of it is 3 stations. The fruit of these types of dhikr, there are 3 stations. Shukr, and this is where you really have an experience of immense hope in God. Allah puts in your heart this immense hope in God and trust that God is going to fulfill His promises, that everything that you want will be answered. The second is quwwat al-raja. The first is shukr. The second is this hope. The third is mahabba. And because the muhsin is mahbub. So anybody that does good to you, you're going to love them. If you're healthy, I mean, sick people don't have that. But if you're healthy, you love people that do good to you. Sick people, actually, it makes them angry. They get resentful. That's really true. It's hard to believe, but you have to taste that to experience it. And then he says, as for saying, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil, the fruit is trust in Allah. And that's why hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakil is a very good dhikr to do when you're worried. Right? In the Quran, when the people said to them, you know, إِذْ قَالَ لَهُمُ النَّاسُ إِنَّ النَّاسَ قَدْ جَمَعُوا لَكُمْ فَاخْشَوْهُمْ فَزَادَهُمْ إِيمَانًا وَقَالُوا حَسْبُنَا اللَّهُ وَنِعْمَ الْوَكِيلُ فَانْقَلَبُوا بِنِعْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَفَضْلٍ لَمْ يَمْسَسْهُمْ سُوءٌ وَاتَّبَعُوا رِضْوَانَ اللَّهِ. When the people came and said, oh, all of the people, they're gathered against you, they're going to conquer you. Right? This is in the Quran. When they told them that to scare them, the Sahaba, it increased their faith. Why did it increase their faith? Because Allah promised, I'm going to test you. So they knew, oh, this is the test that we were promised. So they increased in faith. And then what did they say? Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel. Allah is enough for us. We're not afraid of these people because God is their God as well. So, they gained a great blessing from God in this. وَفَضْلٍ, and bounty from God, and no harm came to them. So when you say Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel a lot, this trust in God will begin to emerge in your heart. And you won't feel that fear that normal people feel in those things. And then also a tafweed, that you resign your affairs to God and you trust in God. You have this trust in God. And as for the names that have the meanings of ittila', that Allah is aware of you, that Allah is seeing you, like al-alim, al-sami', the knower, the hearer, al-basir, the seer, al-raqib, the watcher, and those types of names, their fruit is muraqabah, that you start to become aware of God's awareness of you. So you begin to become aware of the awareness of God of you. And as for prayer on the Prophet ﷺ, the fruit of this is an intense love for the Prophet ﷺ. And, you know, Udma knows Sidi Ismail, who's an example of that, who does prayer. That's his whole dhikr. It's just prayer on the Prophet. And his love for the Prophet is, you won't find a person that loves the Prophet like him. It's just, his love is so immense. He's a person from Fez. But his whole, all he does is dhikr of the Prophet, just salah ala nabi. That's his life. Literally, his life. You lived with their family. His kids do it all the time. It's just, that's their life. And he has so much love for the Prophet because that's all he does. So it really does, I mean, he's saying, look, this is real. If you do these things, you're going to get the effects. These are the fruits of doing these things. And then he says, and also, al-muhafadha ala ittiba' sunnati, you'll want to behave like the Prophet. And the thing about Sidi Ismail, he doesn't have the outward sunnahs that a lot of people focus on, but he has the character of the Prophet. He's following the sunnah that nobody follows anymore. You know, everybody's got the sunnah of the beard, the siwak, the short robe, but the akhlaq of the Prophet, the love the Prophet had for people, their care, that's the real ittiba'. It's not to belittle those other things, but if you're focusing on those other things and neglecting the reality, his inward reality, his forbearance, his care, his concern, his mercy, all those things, then you're missing the point. And as for istighfar, asking forgiveness, the thamra is istiqama, that you'll be more upright in your character and be a person of taqwa and preserve the conditions of tawbah with this inkisar al-qalb bisabab al-dhunub al-mutaqaddima. You'll also be humbled because you're aware of your previous sins. So when you're in a state of istighfar, because you're thinking about your own shortcomings, it humbles you. Arrogant people tend to forget who they are and what they've done. They look at other people and they forget they've done similar things. So then he says, the benefit of the dhikr of all of these names and attributes All of these benefits are in dhikr al-fard. It's in the single dhikr, and that's saying Allah, Allah, Allah. And that is the extreme, that is the furthest purpose or end, and it's where everything arrives to. So, and that's not something, to do that consistently, you do need help. So I wouldn't encourage anybody to do that. The best thing is to focus on your prayer in its time, to do the dhikrs, especially the du'as the Prophet gave us to do every morning and evening, those type things. That's the most important thing. Be consistent in those. For people that are really serious and are getting up at night and doing things, then you need some help. Gain some help from somebody who has authority in that area, and that's true. The dhikr al-fard, there's a debate about it. I was actually surprised to find this in the book because of Ibn Juzayy, but it's definitely the Shadri, Abu Hassan, Ibn Atayillah, they're from that school. Not all the schools do that, doing Allah, 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 doing the dhikr al-fard. There's good hadith. The Prophet said the end of time won't come until people stop saying Allah, Allah, Allah. So, I'm talking about, this is a science. It's an experimental science, and just like any experimental science, you do things, things happen. It's like chemistry. You put this chemical in with this one, you get a reaction. Some of those reactions in chemistry are dangerous. When you get a chemistry kit for children, there's warnings, right? Certain things are done in the supervision of an adult. Well, it's like that with dhikr. There's certain things that you need the supervision of somebody that knows the effect. There's people that do names and they go crazy. And I've seen this, so I'm talking from experience. I have seen there's something called spiritual psychosis. It's real and it happens to people. There are people that do too much dhikr and they start getting psychotic. And that's why certain dhikrs are cold, they're cool, like prayer on the Prophet is a very cooling dhikr. It subdues the self. And there are other dhikrs that heat it up and they start burning things up and people can't take it. And then people are different. Some people are very balanced by nature. Other people are very volatile. So the dhikrs they do should be appropriate to the type personality or character that they have. And I would generally say, dhikr is medicine. Allah describes it as shifa, right? The Quran is a shifa. There are over-the-counter drugs, and then there are drugs that you need a doctor for. All right? As simple as that. You have over-the-counter drugs. Most of what the Prophet gave us is over-the-counter. But when you start getting into numbers and specific, like doing specific names, you need people that know what they're doing with that, because it's just not appropriate for people to be doing certain things. So, with caution. Now I want to finish this because we're done now, but he says, فَدُونَكَ أَيُّهَا السَّادِقُ. So there you are, O wayfarer. فَدُونَكَ أَيُّهَا السَّادِقُ. I just explained it all to you. The rest is up to you. It also, dunaka means take care, get to work. وَبِاللَّهِ tawfiq, and with Allah's tawfiq, and He is enough for us and the best of protectors. Alhamdulillah. So that's the section. The next one's on sabr. Jazakumullah khairan.